Good afternoon. We are here with Mrs. Minkowitz, and and we have just an interview with her. And I thank her so much for having accepted our invitation. When I thought about this interview, I didn't imagine that this interview would become a sort of leitmotif for our conference, for our Congress in Italy, because when step by step, when I was reading her marvelous book called Reimagining Crisis Support, I saw that all the topics, all the issues, all her thoughts were very, very similar to what I think and what our organization thinks about this issue. So just a little presentation of Mrs. Minkowitz. She is a theorist and a practitioner of international human rights law from a survivor of psychiatry perspective. She contributed significantly to the drafting of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities and to its subsequent interpretation and application, which is ongoing. From 2002 to 2015, she represented the World Network of Users and Survivors of Psychiatry in various capacities. Currently, she is the president of the Center of the Human Rights of Users and Survivors of Psychiatry, which she founded in 2009. Some examples of the projects of the center are a self-study course on the CRPD from survivor of psychiatry perspective and the absolute prohibition campaign. Mrs. Minkowitz, I start with this question.
So I feel that I had always had an interest in paying attention to people who needed support of some kind and who were being left out of society. I felt that had applied to myself in many ways from an early age. When I was locked up in psychiatry, which happened at the age of 18, it was very traumatic, and it taught me a lot about how the world worked that I couldn't ignore. I became involved in the survivors movement and have been involved for more than 40 years. So that was really how I came to care so much about the issues here.
Okay, thank you. Another question is, how did it come that you participated to the working groups for the drafting of the CRPD?
Thank you. The World Network of Users and Survivors of Psychiatry was an organization that I was connected with at the time. And that organization had the opportunity to get involved in the UN process to draft a new convention, which started in 2002. So I made a proposal for how we should approach the work on the convention. I remember at first I just wrote out a few bullet points, and the board of the World Network liked my ideas and asked me to draft a statement for an initial meeting in Mexico City. The Mexican government, which had pushed forward the proposal to start work on a convention, they were really being informed by the disability rights movement in Mexico and in Latin America as a whole. And so they knew that they needed to convene a meeting, an expert meeting of all the global organizations of people with disabilities, so to speak. And and the Latin American ones, which is essentially what they did. And the World Network was able to have the opportunity to be part of this because they had positioned themselves as part of the International Disability Alliance. So I did draft a statement. Carl Bach, a WNUSP leader, who some of your members may know, he was very active in ENAS also, took the statement that I drafted to the meeting, and he was very happy with the results because our key advocacy points were taken up in a joint statement made by the NGOs present. That statement actually became the basis for the first set of discussions in the UN itself, because the governments really understood they didn't know what to do in drafting a disability rights treaty. They understood that it was the people whose rights were affected who were the ones who had to give leadership to it. And so in this document made by the NGOs that included the points of the World Network, it was essentially a list of the rights that we thought should be included in the convention and more or less how they should be dealt with. So that's what happened at Mexico City. And then I think it was my suggestion that I represent WNUSP in the meetings that took place at the UN in New York City. I lived in New York City, and it was essentially based on the statement that I had drafted that I felt that we had the basis to go forward, and WNUSP agreed. So to get to the drafting part, there were many proposals for the text of the convention made by NGOs and governments, and among them was a proposal of language that I submitted, that I had drafted with input from WNUSP and submitted on its behalf. So there were numerous proposals, and I remember there was a stack a couple of inches high if you printed them all out. There were also different alternatives that governments or groups of governments were proposing as to how to make a drafting group. And so one of them, or to actually how to come up with one common draft of the convention, there was one proposal to just start with the text the Mexican government had developed. There was another proposal to have an expert group go off and meet somewhere. The DPOs, disabled people's organizations, where we had positioned ourselves, we all felt that neither of those would give us any particular influence or participation in the process. And we were supporting a third alternative that eventually came into being, which was a working group that met for 2 weeks in January of 2004, that was composed of 27 governments, 12 NGOs, and one national human rights institution. The 12 NGO slots were for the 7 global disability organizations in the International Disability Alliance, of which the World Network was one, and then 5 other seats chosen to have representation of disabled people's organizations from each region. And there was an agreement in WNUSP that I should be the one to undertake this representation. And that was how I came to personally be part of that drafting process.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Now I want to talk about your book. And the book is called Reimagining Crisis Support, Matrix, Roadmap and Policy. I quote directly from your book. The book aims to shift, this is very important, to shift the conversation about personal crisis from one based in mental health discourse to one based in a social model of disability and human rights. The book's primary thesis is that crisis support can be reimagined as support for decision-making and maintaining an independent life in the community, as provided for under Articles 12 and 19 of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. In the book, we find these two very important concepts, the concepts of demedicalization and dejudicialization in crisis support. Could you explain what you mean?
Sure. So these are the two principles that seem necessary to define a crisis support that someone like me, as a survivor of abuse at the hands of the psychiatric system, might want to accept, and that we would experience as something potentially helpful and not harmful. And I think it's important to take a survivor perspective, because there are really many of us, vast numbers of us out there, who have been harmed by the psychiatric system, those of us who speak out about it, and those who know they were harmed or may not even be consciously aware of it, but but the harm is there, even if they're not particularly, even if it's not particularly part of their consciousness. And I think it's important to take a survivor perspective, because for one, to make sure that the sorry, I'm losing my threads here.
Okay.
I think the main thing to say about it is that a survivor perspective has a lot to teach everyone about focusing on what are the real needs in crisis and what kind of response could be useful versus what kind of response is actually abusive. I think that our instinct in looking at anything proposed as crisis support are valuable to distinguish those things. So these are the two principles that came to me as important. By demedicalization, I mean that there's no diagnosis and no attribution of anything a person does or says or believes to the notion of an illness. So if a person is acting in ways that are unusual to people around them, if the person is communicating in a way that people find hard to understand, if the person has ideas or beliefs or appears to be going through a state of consciousness that people don't understand or find unusual, there's no reason to call it an illness. And we have found it harmful and dehumanizing for these experiences and these ways of being to be labeled as an illness. So that's what I mean as demedicalization. And this is necessary to respond to the person simply as a human being, to get away from, the mental health framing, which says, here's a person with an illness, and then everything they do in relation towards you has this kind of barrier about it, and instead just relate as one human being to another. By dejudicialization, I mean that there's no authority given to anyone who responds to a request for crisis support to act in any way towards the person other than simply to respond to their support needs in a way that the person welcomes and finds accessible. So there's no power of coercion, either direct or indirect, no manipulation or deception. There's just no official mandate. The people who respond to a request for crisis support simply need to be there to give support, and support has to respect the person's will and preferences, the way Article 12 of the Convention maintains. And the support responders cannot be acting as an arm of the state, that they have to go and intervene in some way. It has to be all purely guided by the person's will and preferences. They shouldn't be keeping records on it or reporting to anybody. I mean, they might need to keep records of, say, how many calls they responded to, just to kind of see what the need is for this kind of service, if it's being done in that way. But they should not be essentially acting as an arm of the state or have any legal mandate towards the person, other than simply to support them in accordance with the person's own will and preferences. And I would say both of these principles actually relate to the right to legal capacity, because demedicalization is really about supporting personhood, relating to people. You can even say, some people have said that the core of legal capacity is a right to personhood. And the dejudicialization means that everything is in accordance with the person's will and preferences.
Okay, thank you. Some governments have shortened the time limits for involuntary hospitalization in psychiatry. You know that Italy also, unfortunately, continues to allow short-term, but not so short, very often not so short-term involuntary hospitalization, and practices of mechanical restraint, sedation, and long-acting injection of drugs continue unabated. What do you think about it?
Well, of course, those are serious human rights violations, and as I wrote in my book, and I think that what you're saying is partly a quote from what I said. So yes. Those are serious human rights violations. It was from Hervé de Sancy, and I think there may have been a few others, but primarily and most recently Hervé, that I learned about the true situation in Italy. And I'm happy to have made that point, because I think it's a problem for all of us, certainly in Italy and also worldwide, that this country is being used as an example and promoted as if it has a lot of good practices, when we know there are serious human rights abuses. So clearly all of the things you mentioned are contrary to the CRPD and simply need to be ended. Clear human rights violations.
Okay. In your book, you also talk about the Swedish model of the personal ombudsman. You say the description of practice by Pius Kahn is the best guide for respecting the person's will and preferences in the context of outreach to other support, and for maintaining confidentiality and absence of a hierarchy throughout a support engagement. Do you know that in Italy we still have guardianship and substitute support administration? What do you think about it?
Well, again, that's also a clear human rights violation. The CRPD committee is very clear about the interpretation of Article 12, that all guardianship, all substitute decision-making regimes have to be eliminated. And that, of course, includes the system of involuntary commitment and forced treatment in the mental health system, as well as I'm not really certain what a substitute support administration is, but if it's substitute decision-making, if it's anything where another person has the power to impose something in someone's life that's against their will or not based on respect for that person's will and preferences, it's clearly a violation. I want to mention that most countries still have guardianship and substitute decision-making, but Peru and Colombia have the most advanced legal reforms of legal capacity of their civil codes that have eliminated guardianship and and substitute decision-making, essentially, in general and in many specific examples. So both of those countries also have at least the possibility of using these legislations to abolish forced psychiatry. And I think, everybody in the human rights community knows that where guardianship exists, a guardian can easily put someone in a psychiatric setting or institution and consent to drugging on their behalf. And it can be almost impossible to get out of that situation. Guardianship can be a very extreme infringement on a person's life, generally preventing the person from having any life of their own. So it's really important to abolish guardianship and any substitute decision-making through legal reforms, as well as to make sure that we are abolishing any basis for involuntary commitment and involuntary interventions that they call treatment in the psychiatric system.
Okay, thank you. Just to mention again, just to quote again your book, I love this passage. Crisis support should be reimagined and framed outside of mental health discourse and practices. My preferred approach with respect to mental health services is to diminish their presence and deny them a sphere of control over policies, and practices of support for people experiencing crisis, distress, and unusual perceptions. I would like to talk about this concept to conclude our interview, because I think this is the core, this is the essence of the book.
Okay, so say that the notion that it's not a mental health service, but that it's a social practice, because I was trying to find where if I had made notes about this. Okay, so I guess I'm somewhat relating this to what does it mean? Because I see it not only as a social practice, but as a practice of community. And I think ideally, in some ways, I think if our communities if our communities had real strong bonds, some of us do in the world, there's such a vast variety in the ways that people have community, don't have community, have very imperfect community. But if community is working really well, I think community can and should be able to simply take this on, that when someone in a neighborhood, in a family, in a network of friends is going through a hard time, let's say, I don't really understand what this person is going through, but if I care about them, if we care about each other, if there's enough of us doing this together, we can make it our business to just keep responding to this person in a way that is reaching out, trying to help them do whatever it is they're trying to do, get through whatever it is they're trying to get through, be comfortable during this time. And especially, I think often, because I have said that decision-making support can be really crucial. It doesn't mean that you sit down with the person and say, okay, what are you struggling with? Let's make a list of the pros and cons. Often that just, like, what? But often I think just being aware that there may be something that this person is struggling with, and we have to be really completely open to what that might be and what they might need in order to figure that out. It might be like just a shift in attitude that they need to take, or it might be some decisive action. And I think that we should be able to do this with each other. The thing is, I think in most places, as the world is now, or in many places, but I would say probably most places, there is a need for some kind of dedicated group of people who make it their responsibility to respond to requests for crisis support. I don't want that to be the mental health system, because the mental health system comes with a lot of baggage, both its legacy of abuse, its ongoing involvement in abuse, the medicalization, just a whole set of usually regulations and attitudes toward people that make it like you're not really part of the community. You're not really acting as a community member when you go in as a mental health provider. And I do know that there are some people who work in mental health services. Often they're people who are themselves having socially marginalized identities. So in the US, many of the mental health professionals who I see as trying to come to their work in a way that's just human are African American, sometimes people who are marginalized based on a sexual orientation and gender identity as well. And they're trying, but I think it's not enough, because people who try to be simply human within the mental health system, they're going against that system. And I think that we need to set that system aside, not make it the center of anything we do, and develop from underneath the simply community-based practices. So I think if you have people who are a dedicated group responding, I think it is still, given the fact that we have the mental health system, we haven't yet done away with it. I think, and even if we did, I think it's not easy to avoid recreating the negative aspects of mental health services, bringing all of that back in, but that's something that we have to be mindful of. And what I see in the US, and I don't know how much of this is going on in other countries, but initiatives for community safety and accountability, alternatives to the state legal system, the state policing and criminal legal systems, and the alternatives to prisons and all of that, that seems to be a good model and a good place to where crisis support, some good practices for crisis support are being developed in that way. And they do involve some people who also have mental health training, but from what I see, that may be in some ways the best current example of doing it as community practice.
Okay. Thank you, Mrs. Minkowitz. I'm so sorry we have to just to reduce you have reduced the questions, but as I said before, it is a part of a conference. So thank you so much indeed, and good afternoon. Okay, thank you.
Good afternoon. It's been a pleasure. Okay.